God, let this reveal the truth. Teach us. Amen.
Among the crowd watching Jesus walk toward his execution, one ordinary man was suddenly pulled out of his own life by an order from Roman soldiers. His name was Simon of Cyrene. In a matter of seconds, he was forced to carry the wooden crossbeam of a condemned man he had likely never met. And when it was over, he disappeared from the Gospels almost as quickly as he had appeared. But did his story really end there? Or did the writers of the New Testament leave behind hidden clues about what became of Simon and his family? Today we're going to follow those clues, compare the biblical accounts with the historical context of the first century, and discover why many scholars believe that a meeting lasting only a few minutes may have changed not only Simon's life, but also the future of his children, and perhaps even the growth of the early Christian church. At first glance, Simon of Cyrene seems like one of the smallest figures in the story of the crucifixion. His name appears in only a handful of verses. He delivers no speeches, performs no miracles, and disappears almost immediately after helping Jesus carry the crossbeam to Golgotha. For many readers, he seems like nothing more than a passing character who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But when we look more closely at what the Gospel writers recorded, something unusual begins to emerge. Mark doesn't simply tell us Simon's name, he adds what appears to be an unnecessary detail. Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. If those two men weren't already known to the first Christians, why would Mark bother mentioning them at all? That single sentence has sparked centuries of discussion among historians, biblical scholars, and theologians alike. From that moment on, Simon's story becomes much larger than the account of a man forced to carry the cross of a condemned prisoner. It opens the door to a Jewish community in North Africa, the pilgrimage routes that brought thousands of worshippers to Jerusalem, the rise of the earliest Christian churches, and a possible connection between Simon's family and people mentioned years later in the letters of the Apostle Paul. It's important to say from the beginning that not every connection can be proven with absolute certainty. Some are supported directly by the biblical text, others are carefully argued hypotheses based on historical evidence, cultural context, and the surviving records of the early church. Throughout this investigation, we'll separate what we know, what can reasonably be reconstructed, and what remains a possibility. Because nearly 2,000 years later, the story of Simon of Cyrene still holds questions that history has never fully answered. Before we can understand what may have happened to Simon after the crucifixion, we first need to answer a much more basic question. Who exactly was this man who suddenly appeared in the Gospel accounts? The three synoptic Gospels all agree on one essential point. Simon was not one of Jesus' disciples, nor was he a resident of Jerusalem. Instead, the texts identify him as a man from Cyrene, an important city in North Africa located in what is now modern-day Libya. At the time, Cyrene was part of the Roman Empire and was home to one of the largest Jewish communities outside the land of Israel. That detail helps explain why Simon was in Jerusalem during Passover. Every year, thousands of Jews living throughout the Roman world travelled to the Holy City to celebrate one of the most important festivals in the Jewish calendar. The journey was long, expensive, and physically demanding, but it was considered a great privilege for those who were able to make it. Families spent weeks crossing the Mediterranean or travelling overland before finally arriving in Jerusalem. It was in that setting that Simon entered the city. The Gospels tell us nothing about his occupation, his age, or the specific reason for his journey, but everything suggests that he was simply another pilgrim among the massive crowds filling Jerusalem during the feast. Nothing indicates that he knew Jesus personally or had any previous connection with his followers. Up to that moment, his visit seems to have been nothing more than the ordinary religious pilgrimage of a Jew living in the diaspora. There is another detail that's often overlooked. Cyrene appears several times elsewhere in the New Testament in connection with the earliest Christian communities. The book of Acts mentions Jews from Cyrene who were present in Jerusalem at Pentecost, and it later records believers from Cyrene playing an important role in the spread of Christianity to Antioch. These passages do not prove that Simon was already connected to this movement before the crucifixion, but they do show that his hometown remained closely linked to the events surrounding the birth of the church. So when the Roman soldiers suddenly stopped that pilgrim from North Africa, They probably saw nothing more than a strong man standing in the crowd. Simon, meanwhile, almost certainly believed he was simply taking part in another Passover pilgrimage. It's hard to imagine that anyone present could have guessed that this unexpected encounter would make his name one of the most remembered in the entire story of Christ's Passion. That morning, Jerusalem looked very different from the city Simon had likely found when he first arrived for Passover. The streets were overflowing with pilgrims, merchants, Roman soldiers, and curious onlookers following a public execution ordered by the authorities. Among the condemned was Jesus of Nazareth, who had already endured interrogation, brutal beatings, and the sentence of crucifixion. According to Roman custom, the condemned man was required to carry the horizontal beam of the cross, known by historians as the patibulum, to the place of execution. Made from heavy timber, it could weigh dozens of pounds and was placed across the prisoner's shoulders as part of the punishment itself. The purpose wasn't simply to transport the wood to Golgotha, it was to prolong the humiliation in front of the crowds. The Gospels tell us that at some point along the route, Jesus could no longer carry it alone. After hours of physical abuse, his body was giving way under the strain. For the Roman soldiers, this created a practical problem. The execution had to continue. If the prisoner collapsed before reaching the place of crucifixion, the public display of Roman authority would lose much of its intended impact. So the soldiers turned toward the crowd, looking for someone who could take the burden. Roman law gave them the authority to do exactly that. Soldiers could legally compel civilians in the provinces to carry equipment or perform certain services whenever necessary. It wasn't a request, it was an order. Refusing meant openly defying the military authority of Rome. That is the moment Simon enters the story. The Gospels simply tell us that he was coming in from the countryside when he was forced to carry Jesus' crossbeam. They never explain why he was chosen over everyone else. Perhaps he happened to be standing closest to the procession. Perhaps his physical appearance caught the soldiers' attention. The text never says. And that silence is part of what makes the scene so powerful. From that moment on, Simon walked the final stretch to Golgotha, carrying the very beam that would soon be used in Jesus' crucifixion. We don't know whether the two men exchanged a single word. We don't know what Simon was thinking as he walked beneath the eyes of the crowd. The Gospel writers deliberately leave those questions unanswered, choosing instead to record only the event itself. But there is one remarkable detail. Out of the thousands of pilgrims who filled Jerusalem that week, Simon is one of the very few whose name was preserved. And Mark goes even further. He doesn't simply identify Simon. He tells us that Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. That seemingly small detail transforms an otherwise brief episode into one of the New Testament's most intriguing mysteries. Because if those names were included, there's a good chance the earliest readers already knew exactly who Alexander and Rufus were, and that single clue changes the entire investigation into what may have happened to Simon after that unforgettable day. After the crucifixion, Simon of Cyrene virtually disappears from the biblical narrative. The Gospels never tell us where he went, how long he lived, or whether he eventually returned to Cyrene. At first glance, it seems as though his role ends the moment Jesus reaches Golgotha. But there is one detail that has fascinated biblical scholars for centuries. When describing this scene, the Gospel of Mark does something ancient. Writers rarely did when introducing someone completely unknown. Instead of simply giving Simon's name, Mark adds what appears to be an unnecessary piece of information. Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. That immediately raises an important question. Why mention the names of this man's sons if Simon himself appears only once in the entire Gospel? In the literature of the ancient world, this kind of identification usually served a purpose. Writers often referred to family members only when they expected their audience to recognize them. Otherwise, the detail would add nothing to the story. That observation has led many scholars to suggest that Alexander and Rufus may have already been well-known figures within the early Christian communities for whom Mark was writing. Of course, this cannot be presented as a certainty. Mark never says that Simon became one of Jesus' followers, nor does he explicitly tell us that his sons became part of the early church. But the simple fact that their names appear at all is difficult to ignore. Out of the countless unnamed people present during the crucifixion, only Simon receives this kind of family identification. That single sentence, which many readers pass over without a second thought, has become one of the strongest clues pointing toward what may have happened to Simon's family after that extraordinary day. And the investigation doesn't end there. Years later, Another man with the same uncommon name appears in one of the Apostle Paul's letters. Is it simply a coincidence, or could Mark and Paul actually be referring to the same person? That's exactly the possibility that has kept this discussion alive for generations. And if you enjoy uncovering hidden details like these, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing just how far these stories travel, because now we're about to examine one of the most debated connections in the entire New Testament. Several years after the crucifixion, the Apostle Paul wrote his letter to the Christians in Rome. Near the end of the letter, in chapter 16, he sends greetings to a number of believers. Among them appears a short sentence that has attracted the attention of historians and biblical scholars for generations. Paul writes, "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been a mother to me as well." At first, it seems like just another personal greeting among many others. But when that verse is placed alongside Mark's Gospel, a fascinating possibility begins to emerge. Could this Rufus be the very same son of Simon of Cyrene mentioned during the crucifixion? There are several reasons why many scholars consider the idea plausible. Mark deliberately identifies Simon as the father of Rufus, suggesting that his readers already knew who Rufus was. Years later, Paul mentions a Christian named Rufus, who appears to have been a respected member of the church in Rome. If both writings circulated among closely connected Christian communities, it is entirely possible that they were referring to the same individual. There is another detail worth noticing. Paul speaks warmly of Rufus's mother, saying that she had been like a mother to him. Although he never identifies her by name, some scholars have suggested that she may have been Simon's wife, implying that the entire family eventually became part of the Christian movement. At the same time, it's important to recognise the limits of this theory. Rufus was not an exceptionally rare Roman name, and nowhere does the New Testament explicitly state that the Rufus mentioned by Paul is the son of Simon of Cyrene. Nor do we possess any surviving first-century document that confirms the connection beyond doubt. For that reason, most historians describe it as a well-supported possibility rather than an established historical fact. Even so, it's remarkable that a man who appears for only a few moments in the Gospel accounts may continue leaving traces in other New Testament writings. And if this connection is correct, it would mean that Simon's unexpected encounter on the road to Golgotha didn't simply change his own life. It may have shaped the future of his entire family and their place within the earliest generations of the Christian church. After that day, the scriptures fall completely silent about Simon of Cyrene. None of the Gospels tell us whether he returned to his homeland, remained in Jerusalem, or witnessed the growth of the early church. There is no contemporary account describing his final years. For anyone searching for a definitive ending, that silence can feel frustrating. Yet, strangely enough, it is precisely that silence that has made Simon's story so compelling throughout the centuries. Early Christian tradition preserved different memories about what may have happened next. Some later writings suggest that Simon and his family embraced the Christian faith after witnessing the crucifixion. Others claim that his sons became well-known members of the first Christian communities. These traditions, however, were written long after the events themselves and cannot be verified with the same confidence as the New Testament. Even so, they reveal that Simon's name continued to live on in the memory of the earliest believers. There is, however, one fact that is difficult to overlook. Among the thousands of people who filled Jerusalem that day, Simon is one of the very few secondary figures whose name was preserved by the Gospel writers. Mark goes even further by recording the names of his sons. That level of detail would hardly seem necessary unless Simon's family had become familiar to the people reading the Gospel. It isn't definitive proof of what happened afterward, but it is certainly a clue that his story continued beyond the few verses in which he appears. Perhaps that is Simon of Cyrene's greatest legacy. He left home expecting nothing more than an ordinary Passover pilgrimage. He didn't seek recognition, didn't volunteer for history, and almost certainly never imagined that his name would still be remembered nearly 2,000 years later. A single encounter lasting only a few minutes became part of one of the most significant events in the history of Christianity. And perhaps that is the most remarkable conclusion of all. Simon was forced to carry a cross for only a short distance, yet that brief encounter may have transformed not only his own life, but the future of his entire family. We cannot say that with absolute certainty. What we can say is that the clues preserved in the earliest Christian writings make the possibility compelling enough to continue studying even today. Sometimes, it is precisely these small fragments of history that allow us to reconstruct stories that seemed lost forever. We may never know with complete certainty what became of Simon of Cyrene after that unforgettable day. The Gospels leave us with only a few brief references, and history preserves little more than scattered clues hidden within the earliest Christian communities. Yet when those clues are gathered together, a remarkable picture begins to emerge. A pilgrim who travelled from Cyrene to celebrate Passover unexpectedly found himself standing at the centre of one of history's most significant moments. The encounter lasted only a matter of minutes, yet his name has endured for nearly 2,000 years. Perhaps that is why Simon continues to fascinate readers today. He wasn't one of the apostles, he performed no miracles, wrote no letters, and never held a position of leadership in the early church. Even so, his brief appearance on the road to Golgotha was recorded in 3 different Gospels and continues to raise questions that historians, archaeologists, and biblical scholars are still exploring. The more we investigate figures like Simon, the more we realise how many stories remain hidden between the lines of Scripture. Details that seem almost insignificant at first can reveal surprising historical connections when viewed through the lens of archaeology, ancient culture, and the surviving documents of the 1st century. By the way, if you enjoy documentaries like this, you'll find a free ebook linked in the video description. It explores little-known biblical people, places, and events, along with the historical background that helps bring these stories into sharper focus. Be sure to check it out after you've finished watching. Now, I'd love to hear what you think. Do you believe Simon and his family eventually became part of the early Christian church? Or do you think that connection can never be proven? Let me know in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories reach. And if there's another biblical figure you'd like us to investigate, leave your suggestion below. There's a good chance our next documentary will begin with your idea.